9 or 10. I can't remember where we are right now in the quarter. Before we get started, I wanted to just do a few reminders. It's great to see many of you here, and reminders that, and Steve Goodrow reminds me it's week 9. When we during the talks, use the Q&A to post your questions, and we'll have Dr. Rollins do his talk, and then we'll take the questions after the talk. And Dr. Rollins told me ahead of time that he's really keen to have a robust conversation. So looking forward to learning and getting some insights and thoughts from all of you. Before we start the program and before I introduce Dr. Rollins, I wanted to give Jessica a chance to do a shout out with regards to next week's lightning talks.
Yeah, everybody, we have our second lightning talks of the year next week during CSDE seminar, which is how I know it's not week 10. And we have 6 of our trainees and fellows presenting short talks and then posters, and a lot of the research that you'll see is going to be presented later at PAA, so it would be really awesome for our students and trainees to get feedback and improve their research presentation from all of you. So we hope to see you next week at Lightning Talks.
Thanks, Jessica. Okay, well, without further ado, and I wanted to introduce Professor Oliver Rollins, who is a new faculty member at the University of Washington in the Department of American and Ethnic Studies. Dr. Rollins is a qualitative sociologist who works on race and racism in and through and how it is manifested in science and technology. And he's particularly interested in how racial identity, racialized discourses, and systemic practices of social difference influence and are affected by the making and use of neuroscientific technologies and knowledges. Dr. Rollins is the author of a recent book, Conviction: The Making and Unmaking of the Violent Brain, published by Stanford University Press in 2021. And I believe part of the talk today is a chapter out of that book, and is some reflection on where he might go next with this work. He's currently working on a project that examines the neuroscience of implicit bias, chiefly the challenges, consequences, and promises of operationalizing racial prejudice and identity in neurobiological processes. So we're delighted to have you in our midst, and so glad you're a part of a member of our community at CSDE, and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Sarah. I will go ahead and share my screen now before I start getting into the talk. All right, so it should be up now. Just let me know if you're not able to see it. So,
good.
Okay, cool. So again, thank you, Sarah, and thank you everyone in the CSDE community. I'm pretty excited to give this talk. It's a little variation from my, I have a book talk, but this is a little variation of the book talk because it's an area where I'm thinking about expanding my research a little bit. And so I want to both give the talk, but I also want to kind of use the discussion both to ask, obviously you guys can ask me any questions about kind of this part of the research, or even the larger kind of the book research or the projects that I'm kind of working on. But I'm also really interested in kind of your thoughts. And so I'll actually post some questions toward the end, or just kind of post some thoughts I have that maybe can jump off into some other kind of comments. And they're kind of around kind of some methodological questions about kind of advancing my work into quantitative analysis or mixed method analysis of the ways in which what I'm calling kind of the therapeutic promise or the use of neuroprediction works. And in particular here, I'm not necessarily thinking about, I'm both thinking about, potential ways in which neuroscientists might improve upon, let's say, neuromarkers, but I'm also thinking about, kind of critiques of this work and what does it mean to kind of use quantitative methods to also critique or show kind of the shortcomings in particular work. I also want to kind of build theoretically about just kind of this model. So maybe some questions about particularly how we quantify the social And then bioethics, I'm kind of also thinking about kind of like particularly a question of kind of what does it mean to kind of inform the public about both neuroscientific knowledges, but also this particular kind of understanding around bioprediction. And so with that, I will actually start my talk. And so as Sarah noted, this is coming from a selection out of my book. And so during the talk, I'll actually kind of talk about the book in general and kind of the larger argument I'm making in the book. But here I want to focus specifically on one of the chapters where the chapter is kind of called like Fixing Brains. But within that chapter, I'm looking particularly at this notion of neuroprediction. And these are neuroscientists. So in the project, I was looking at neuroscientists who studied antisocial behavior or criminality. And I was really interested. I mean, I went into it really interested, thinking about how they were using this concept of race. But toward the end, what it became more important for me was to both think about how they're using race, but also how their work simultaneously is answering a critique of kind of the past. So this is a science that's always been looked at as very fraught. And so how the work today both tries to answer critiques of the past, and one of the biggest critiques is kind of thinking about kind of the social, right? So moving away from a deterministic model, but also moving away from kind of these racist kind of logics that were built into the early work. So as I completed my research, as I was completing this research, so one question that constantly came up for me from, lay publics and others was, what are neuroscientists planning to do with this stuff? Moreover, is this like Minority Report? So arguably one of the most popular science fiction depictions of brain science gone wrong is Philip K. Dick's 1956 short story, Minority Report, and the 2002 blockbuster film of the same title based off the work. Here I show an image of the protagonist played by Tom Cruise in the 2002 film Minority Report. The story centers on a futuristic government agency, the Pre-Crime Division, that was developed to identify and arrest criminals before they engage in criminal activity. The novelty of the Pre-Crime Division rests in its ability of precogs, a select group of individuals with extraordinary psychic powers, although otherwise described as incoherent minds that are dull, confused, and lost in the shadows. When precogs are hooked up into analytic machines, law enforcement officials are able to capture and decipher their psychic visions through computing mechanisms that yield the names of soon-to-be criminals. The parallel outlooks of appeal and suspicion with pre-crime are encapsulated perfectly in Dick's version of the story through a conversation between the story's protagonist, Detective John Atherton, and his newly appointed assistant, Ed Winter. Atherton notes, "You've probably already grasped the basic legalistic drawback to pre-crime methodology. We're taking in individuals who have broken no law." "But they surely will," Whitner affirmed with conviction. Atherton replies, "Happily they don't, because we get them first, before they can commit an act of crime. So the commission of the crime itself is absolute metaphysics. We can claim they are culpable. They, on the other hand, can eternally claim they're innocent. And in a sense, they are innocent. In our society, we have no major crimes," Atherton goes on, "but we do have a detention full of would-be criminals." Now, neuroscientists are not secretly developing a precog system to arrest individuals before they commit a crime. The dystopian future portrayed in Minority Report, however, is relevant for the discussion today because today's neuroscience envisions the violent brain model as a future solution to antisocial and criminal behavior, a mind-reading technology that will help us identify neurobiological markers that underpin potential for crime. The violent brain. So for me, the violent brain model is not a term that's actually used by neuroscientists. This is a term that I coined or used throughout the book to talk about this new brain type thought to capture and predict new kinds of violent subjects, so-called potential criminals. Compared to the precog, seemingly certain images of criminals, the violent brain model outlines susceptible individuals who, under less predictable and unfavorable settings, might be unable to restrain their behavioral impulses and act out violently. However, Working in terms of brain risk instead of clairvoyant visions does not necessarily prevent the violent brain from engendering a pre-crime-like system. That is, treating the susceptible individual, the soon-to-be criminal, as the actual criminal. The violent brain then is a regime of truth. It binds together social and psychological understandings and remakes and reshapes questions, experiences, and explanations into a presumably coherent, biomedically useful reality of violence. To be clear, neuroscientists are less interested in detecting who is criminal or determining fault, innocence, or guilt. They reject deterministic and fixed understandings of biology and violence that were once considered principal components of biocriminology. In turn, they suggest that the violent brain construct is a more promising biomedical understanding of violence, eliminating the need to emphasize crime and criminals directly. Moreover, the move towards elucidating risk and not actually criminals means that the violent brain operates under an ideology of the therapeutic promise. Right. So unlike before, right, the therapeutic promise is tries to separate. Now I'm gonna define what that means, but tries to separate or is separate kind of from these visions of the past. And so here, I want to kind of just point to, how, I guess, what this therapeutic promise is kind of responding to, I should say. So in an editorial brief in the prestigious journal of American Medical Sociology, American Medical Association, or JAMA, Harvard neurosurgeons Vernon Mark and Frank Irvin claimed that violence was the result of a neuropsychological illness that could be cured through psychosurgery, essentially a lobotomy. So this was in 1967, right? So in 1967, they write this editorial that suggests that brain injuries is the cause of urban riots, right? And so the idea of psychosurgery was literally a lobotomy that you could use to actually fix, violence or cure violence in a particular type of way. And what I want to the reason I point this out is because one of the things that neuroscientists are doing today is kind of pointing to the past to show how much they progressed. So they use examples like this to show how much they moved away, right? Moved away from the particular negative kind of use of biocriminology or neurocriminology in the past. So the violent brain model is not functioning as a backdoor to lobotomize away an individual's risk for violence like the predecessors in the 1960s. The therapeutic function of neuroscience of violence is not a direct route to state-sanctioned social control, but instead is based on a more tempered and discursive therapeutic promise. The therapeutic promise is part of a larger imaginary that dictates how and why the violent brain model ought to be relied upon as a viable answer to violence. In the most simplified understanding, the therapeutic promise embodies the hope that is, as one neuroscientist told me, with each day, neuroscientists can be closer to detecting abnormalities for use for interventions. And as technologies keep improving, neuroscientists and clinicians will be able will keep getting better as well. In this sense, neuroscientists are both working through the past to help quell old debates about the program and constantly trying to understand their presence by borrowing from a cautiously imagined emergent future filled with vitality and uncertainty. The therapeutic promise operates by suspending the want for an immediate cure for violence and replacing such demand with a tentative potential to unlock curative secrets about violence in the future. As captured in the comments from Dr. Lewis, a neuropsychologist working on neurogenetic underpinnings of psychopathy, the fantasy would be to cure psychopaths so that they're not a problem anymore. Don't commit any crimes, don't become a serial killer. However, that might be a little ambitious in one's lifetime. Just to contribute to a body of knowledge that might be more useful for future generations to study work would still be very valuable. Thus, it is the openness of neurobiological knowledges for violence, its reflexiveness, if not uncertainty, that neuroscientists draw upon to both rationalize their work, but also seek to expand the areas to apply brain technologies of violence. The therapeutic promise constitutes and melds together, co-produces neuroscientific interpretations with societal realities. It is part of a larger discursive framework that helps convince others, the state, institutions, potential patients, of its life-saving, creative, and alternating potentials. Interestingly, this has translated into more social rather than science or biomedical intervention at this point, prevention has been about changing brains through sociocultural factors and about using neuromarkers as predictors for the future illness. That is, what we're working here, and I stress this throughout the book, what we end up seeing here is this interesting way in which both, this is a science, what I call a risk of risk, because it's not necessarily about the risk to be a criminal. It is about the risk to be a psychopath, or the risk for a neuropsychological illness or disorder, which then places one at a higher risk to be a criminal. Moreover, it's not necessarily about changing brains in the sense of lobotomy or psychosurgery. It's literally about the ways in which the bio and the social kind of mend together. And so you'll hear neuroscientists say things like the intervention here, the fix here is that children should have better nutrition throughout childhood, or that they should have better education, right? And the point here is not necessarily maybe in the ways in which social scientists may think about these things, but more in a way that with better nutrition, they develop better brains. With better brains, they mitigate the risk of crime, right? However, they're also thinking about this in a way of predicting kind of future crime. So it's not just about mitigating, but it's also thinking about these neuromarkers as a way to predict. And so this is really the crux of kind of what I've been kind of thinking about or wanting to kind of expand upon or think about more. It's kind of this notion of neuroprediction and in a way, just this idea of prediction throughout health, and particularly about social behaviors, in a way that kind of this ultimate goal tends to be kind of to predict things in the future. Neuroprediction, or brain reading as it's sometimes called, is an ultimate goal for neuroimaging research, but it also takes on greater importance for the study of violence. Prediction, in the general sense, suggests an ability to see into the future. In the neurosciences, prediction refers to the statistical meaning of the term, more like an average and optimal outcome given the variables used within a model. This type of predictive power is why neuroscientists invest in the violent brain. The violent brain's perceived ability to read one's future through brain structures and function cultivates hope and promise, not just as research tools, but also as a potential treatment for otherwise incurable abnormal social behaviors. Prediction operates on multiple levels through the violent brain. First, neuroimaging is used to outline and/or determine neurobiological biomarkers, such as an overactive amygdala or smaller prefrontal cortex. Next, using group level analysis, average differences between clinical and control groups, the dysfunction of such biomarkers is linked to neuropsychological diagnosis. Finally, the biomarkers are further targeted in development of interventions, often social practices that are thought to help minimize or correct the impact of these risks on brain functioning. However, risk calculations can never be as precise or specific as neuroscientists would like. As one neuroscientist says, it's really complex and cannot be predicted 100%, not even 90% of the time. And that's something that all neuroscientists you interview will agree with. Moreover, the politics of this science are never outside of bioethical concerns, whether real or imagined, large or small. My conversation with Dr. McKinney highlights the tension around neuroprediction on both its potential benefits and continued worries. Dr. McKinney, a self-described developmental psychopathologist, was a postdoc scholar in a high-profile neuropsychiatry lab on the East Coast of the US during the time of the interview. Dr. McKinney noted that what drew him to neuropsychology, or drew them to neuropsychology and not politics, where they originally thought they would end up, was the realization that most politics are about internal conflicts. Their long-term goal then is to integrate neurobiological models into treatment for antisocial behavior and conduct disorders in kids. Here, Dr. McKinney shares some thoughts about the usefulness and difficulties with prediction they note. So for us, the scientific community has been one of those things where we've started to consult more, especially from more prominent senior folks in political sectors. There's also been lots of media interest, but nothing's really changed for us on the scientific level though. I mean, it's still the same old problem of risk assessment in mental health populations and the problems of balancing individual civil rights and rights to privacy, public safety. And it's difficult, it's going to be difficult. People look to science for guidance. Then we come across as saying, well, We can't tell you that. It's like a lightning strike. I mean, it really is. It's like asking the weatherman to predict who is going to get struck by lightning. Like, no, I mean, it's going to rain tomorrow, probably. I don't know. I can give you some percentages, but no, I can't tell you who's going to get struck by lightning. I can't tell you where the tornado is going to touch down. I can tell you where the risk is really high, but it's not useful information in the same way. People don't understand, again, because fundamentally we're a statistically illiterate society, which is an issue for another study. Thus, although neuroscientists are not promising to predict violent behavior with certainty, the use of neuroimaging tools rests on a promise to help decode what an individual is thinking from their brain activity. Neuroprediction, then, has much more to do with the ability to better elucidate important group level and clinical details about personality disorders associated with violent behavior. Yet this logic carries salient shortcomings, especially when considering the burgeoning relationship between neuroscience and law. The use of neuroscience in law is not new. Since the mid-2000s, there has been an urgent uptake of neuroscience in the realm of law. fMRI scans have been touted as the future of lie detectors and powerful devices to uncover hidden implicit biases among jurors, judges, and attorneys. According to legal and ethics scholars Henry Grindley and Nida Farhani, defense based on neurobiological evidence, which they characterize as their brains made me do it defense, were introduced in nearly 2,800 judicial opinions in the United States between 2005 and 2015. In 2005 Supreme Court case Roper versus Simmons, the courts relied on neuroscientific findings on brain maturity in its ruling that outlawed the death penalty for adolescents or people who are under the age of 18 or under. It is common to perceive adolescence as a developing age in which people do not understand fully the consequences of their actions. However, the Roper versus Simmons decision also demonstrates how social ideologies can be taken up into scientific practices without questions and further hardened. Neuroscientists attempt to link the narratives of maturity and dangerousness makes more sense if we think about the underlying neurobiological description of violence as a clinical inability to regulate one's emotions or control decision-making. However, such brain understandings of violence seems less convincing when the individual is a mature adult with a fully developed brain. This is not to say that neuroscientists' predictions are fabrications, but that the measurable differences are much more about our social understandings with regard to maturity, dangerous, and development as they are. Moreover, the role of neuroscience in courts has expanded well beyond the original evidentiary function. The expansive application of neuroscientific technologies in the courtroom will only increase the chance that such knowledges may be misused or used beyond their functional limit. Neuroscientists and other legal experts have attempted to educate legal professionals about the way neuroscience should be used in the courtroom to help reduce its risk. This point is well illustrated in a publication from the MacArthur Foundation Research Network on Law and Science at Vanderbilt University. Moreover, Dr. McKinney, who I introduced earlier, noted that they also work with judges and other legal professionals, training them to better grasp the importance of neuroscience data. Or in McKinney's words, I discovered that the only way to really make a change is not to convince them through behavioral clinical evidence, even though I honestly and fundamentally believe it is much more informative and better, but we are going to have to show them pictures of brains. Thus, here we are reminded that neither numbers nor statistics speak for themselves. The colorful images of the brain carries its own authority, which may do a far better job at convincing lay audiences of the importance of the violent brain than less accessible statistical equations or charts. This type of neurotraining in the courtroom has consequences as well. Neuroscientists rely on judges as judicial gatekeepers to ensure that understandings of the violent brain will be properly applied in courts. However, preparing judges to know how to see the violent brain works against neuroscientists' stated goals, as it entices judges to believe in the powers of the brain imaging without fully understanding the predictive powers and especially the scientific shortcomings. These hurdles for translating neuroscience knowledge are not limited to misinterpretation of brain scans. A fundamental problem with prediction through the violent brain model is a lack of power in predictive models. This has led some neuroscientists studying violence to reject the use of certain biomarkers for violence in the courtroom. Or as Dr. Fitzpatrick told me, and this is the quote that I have up on the screen, There were a couple of years in which we would regularly be called by people who were interested in using our research as evidence in death penalty hearings or asking if someone has the MAOA low variant. The MAOA is actually a gene that has been tied somewhat fraughtly to violence. So it has become kind of the genetic biomarker for violence. Does this mean that it should be taken into account during such a hearing, whether or not they should receive the death penalty? My own position is that the research is not material because the risk increase from MAOA is so minor that it would do very little towards explaining or scoping individual acts, no matter how heinous. So I'm not in favor of that kind of approach. Like MAOA, neurobiological biomarkers, and MAOA can be considered a neurobiological biomarker as well, also yield small effect sizes. And therefore, they may not bring the dramatic adjudicative and therapeutic impact expected from scientific technologies. That is, they explain only a very small amount of variance and therefore cannot account for the effects, the sociocultural or biological, that may be at play during the act of violence. Moreover, Dr. Fitzpatrick's comments illuminate the group to individual or G2I problem. Simply comparing individual brain scans using these representations of the antisocial brain cannot really prove anything within courts, right? And there's two reasons for that. One is because any of these scans that we see are not actually a scan of a brain, but they're actually a representation of a group averages. So usually in any kind of neurobiological study, you have both your normal group and your study group. And the two pictures that you actually see that I showed kind of earlier in our slides was actually one of the averages from the normal group and one for the averages of the study group. So therefore, just scanning my brain and then comparing it to that actually doesn't tell us anything, right? And then the other thing is that when you look at these measures, right, the measures that they use, because all of these are based on some other kind of measures to help them make these brain scans, right, usually tasks that they do, these neuropsychological tasks. But if we look at the results of the task, we can also see that someone who's in the normal group may have the same scores as someone who's in the control group. Who's in the study group, right? And so therefore, even just looking at a picture of a brain really tells us nothing without contextualizing it within the larger study. So actually using them within the courtroom as they have been is actually pretty fraught. Other neuroscientists have tried to better circumscribe the role of prediction for the criminal justice system. In one study, Kill and colleagues successfully linked neural activation to the anterior cingulate cortex or ACC region of the brain, an area associated with conflict monitoring, to felony arrests. The group noted that the use of violent brain here may provide some predictive advantages over existing behavior models of risk assessment, which have already been used in parole decisions. In this sense, the violent brain is supposed to be used alongside these existing risk assessments to provide a more accurate risk estimate. However, there remains ethical questions about using the brain to predict recidivism. Recidivism is not just indication of criminal behavior, violent or not violent, but like any other arrest, it also reflects socio-cultural dynamics that help dictate where, when, and upon whom to police. Kill's group actually acknowledged this dynamic themselves in their latest publication, which is I have on the slide. It is important to recognize the accuracy equally applies to the outcome variables as it does to predictive variables. Here we have used official arrest records to derive our primary outcome variable, rearrest. Such reports may be biased by police strategies, geography, profiling, etc. Future studies may consider using both self-reported data on criminal activities as well as arrest reports to assess whether one may be accurate or more than the other. This submission is noteworthy as it demonstrates a better recognition of the multifactorial nature of violence and the way that social power influences the way society thinks about and responds to violence. However, predicting violence is a comprehensive political social practice, or social political practice, I should say, embedded in the types of policing practice employed in communities. My concern here is not about the accuracy or more accurate account of arrests, either case merely provides a quantitative data point without taking into account the problematic social dynamics. Here we see an interesting negation that is inherent in neuroprediction. On the one hand, embedded practices of inequality are admittedly rendered too complex for the violent brain model. And I'll talk about this in another chapter, so I can expand on this later if needed. However, on the other hand, the very same complexity here in the form of police records is nevertheless rendered workable and relied upon as a vital research variable when codified through scientific practices of prediction. It's important to note that the group of neuroscientists assert that the violent brain framework illustrates a social or biosocial representation of violence, which affords them the opportunity to capture, redefine, and better quantify things, as one person told me. Specifically social things like the environment and maltreatment, which are now understood as co-constitutive factors with biology in the etiology of violence. In this way, the biosocial rebranding of violence as a neurobiological disorder essentially incorporates and recenters biocriminology's most contentious implication and apparent undermining of the social. Thus, it's also become as a way to better conceptualize and quantify our social lives. Dr. Holmes, another neuroscientist who encourages the use of neuroprediction, envisions a slightly different role of the violent brain in terms of preventing recidivism. The outline goal for Dr. Holmes is to better address long sought answers concerning why some individuals continue to commit crimes or behave violently while others do not, an intervention that could help elucidate both the neurobiology of violence and resilience. Here, the renewed therapeutic promise of the violent brain is more explicitly tied to violence prevention programs to, as Dr. Holmes says, test the efficacy of community intervention programs in the scanner. Dr. Holmes explains, as I have on the board, the experiment would place at-risk youths in the scanner and have them do various sorts of decision-making tasks with and without somebody watching over them on the video feed. The youth would know they're being watched, and they're being watched either by a peer or a community elder. We already know that behaviorally, people will behave differently under circumstances. So then the question is, neurally, why do they behave differently in these circumstances? Now, that may or may not be useful information. The way it could be useful is if we discover that, you know what, people's behavior really changes when, I'll just make something up here, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex comes online because they're being watched by someone they respect. In theory, we could test the efficacy of several different community intervention programs in the scanner. In other words, we can say, all right, well, what would it be like if instead of having a former gang member watch them, we have their grandmother watch them? What would it be like if we have a police officer watch them? What would it be like if their school principal watches them? We could compare the efficacy of different community intervention programs, not by having to run them in the community one at a time, but instead by understanding the associated neurosignatures, like thinking ahead and not watching the reactive violence from these youth. Dr. Holmes' vision would be revolutionary for violence prevention if successful. If successful, it could demonstrate the value of preventative strategies in violence, which often do not yield immediate results and require substantial economic investment, community trust, and political buy-in. However, it also suggests that the violent brain model can cleanse data of its social and potentially unequal nature. There's a theoretical leap being made by Dr. Holmes here between social perception and actual social behavior. The potential behavior outside the lab can be known based on recorded differences in brain activity when social peers or guardians want to watch the participant. It is accurate to think that individuals may behave differently when they are being viewed by different social groups, but this seems to suggest that youth will behave violently only in front of their peers, and that they will always behave properly in the presence of guardians or authorities. Given that they are participating in such a study that requires a willingness from the youth to abide by rather stringent guidelines. So if you've ever been in a scanner, you know that you really have to be still. You have to abide by all of their rules. Otherwise, the scan actually doesn't even work, right? So you have to really be paying attention to the things that they want you to do. And almost kind of in that Foucauldian sense, be a docile body, right? So given this, right, it is unlikely that they will behave differently or inappropriately when they believe a peer is watching them. It is also unlikely that a lab experiment can replicate the social environments or experiences that they would need that would lead to kind of antisocial behavior. What this means is that this intervention takes for granted the interrelationship between social actions and social terrain, which are vital to explanations of violence and risk factors. Maybe the most difficult barrier for neuroprediction will be the public. Even with these sophisticated statistical and technological interpretations of neuroprediction, neuroscientists will still need to convince the public that the violent brain's public good will outweigh its perceived risk. Risk in this sense is not simply a question of stigmatization due to biomedical labels like antisocial or psychopath, which nearly all neuroscientists I talk with know that as a potential social concern, but societal level fears of deterministic-like regimes of prediction. By now, throughout this talk, and essentially as I was writing through the book as well, it was pretty clear that neuroscientists, when they say that a person is at risk for violence, it does not mean destiny for crime. However, such reassurances have not completely shut the door on deterministic thinking either. And so I kind of pull back here to my larger kind of critique of the book, right? And so throughout the book is divided up in kind of two sides, two parts. One part is what I call kind of working with the social, and the other part is I call kind of working against. And both of them are really divided in the sense of kind of what happens in the lab, what happens in the making of the science, kind of the working against, and then what happens when neuroscientists think about applying the science outside, that's kind of working with, right? But what I point out throughout, right, and particularly using kind of the example of race throughout one chapter in the book, is that there's limits on the violent brain model. And so I say that the violent brain model may further preserve seemingly static hierarchies of subjectivity, not through old biodeterministic means, but through the sheer omission of lived experiences, a normative inattention to lives, and the inability of this technology to seriously challenge racialized, marginalizing, and inferiorizing practices that construct the abnormal social behaviors and people recognize as violent, antisocial, and criminal. And part of the reason I came with this is that what another neuroscientist told me, which is actually really related to kind of the neuroprediction stuff, is when I was asking them about, racism and not necessarily race, but racism, right? And this question about racism and how then do we properly both quantify and build in something like racism within a model of prediction. And essentially the reply was, it's too complex, that we can't do it right now, right? And so essentially what this made me think about is a sense not necessarily that this is a racist science or this is a deterministic science, but it made me think about what gets quantified within our life, what counts as a social and what does not, right? Moreover, and importantly, there's also been a slide to healthier and younger populations here, right? And so I think this is the other kind of risk that happens with this model, right? Some interventions for the violent brain, and so some interventions for the violent brain will only focus on, those who exhibit violent criminal behaviors. Others try to stick closer to its mental health approach because this is a biomedical kind of approach. So a lot of them will only say, I'm only thinking about psychopaths, right? That my interventions are only for psychopaths. If I'm predicting, I'm only predicting, a mental health disorder, right? But still, many others think about this in a much more liberal way and making it applicable to any individual, violent or normal alike, right? And so the idea is to actually prevent violence, we need to actually go to younger populations and healthier populations and prevent before, these particular types of biomarkers have a chance to impact them. As it turns out, however, none of the groups that we're talking about here are like mutually exclusive in practice. Interventions that focus on mental health disorders do not exclude normal, healthy individuals who may be one day at risk. So the theoretical distinctions made between clinical groups and general criminal ones have never been precise as neuroscientists suggest. And quite aptly, the violent brain collapses these categorical group distinctions with little resistance. Recognized by some neuroscientists, the blurring of these distinctions between general violence and clinical disorders seems to threaten the value and the predictive capabilities of this model. To be clear, I'm not saying that the measurable distance between healthy and violent research subjects, which is so vital to the violent brain model, has shrunk. Instead, I'm arguing that such an empirical space never truly existed. In producing a picture of the brain or the violent brain, neuroscientists have also constructed a specific image of human beings, a potential criminal, and a seemingly simple and accurate representation of the normal as well, right? So we have a process here that we're not only thinking about predicting the criminal, but in a sense, we're also talking about what actually counts as normal, all right? So part of my question here, also thinking about as we're predicting, then, you know, who actually counts as normal, what counts as normal behavior, right? What counts as normal behavior versus, let's say, risk type taking behavior, in a sense, in the ways in which these models actually work. And so this leads me to kind of my remaining thoughts and questions here as I close up my talk, and kind of some of the things that I'm trying to think through as I move this tiny section from out of the book into thinking about kind of expanding this beyond this and kind of thinking more about biomarkers and particularly neuroprediction. So for me, there's some methodological questions around, are there ways to advance both the science and critique using quantitative analysis or mixed methods? And what can this add or help demonstrate regarding the therapeutic promise in the violent brain model? Theoretically, how to apply new measures to both to both improve health and society? And how are we connecting inequality to biomarkers? So there's a really good piece by Elias Monk, a sociologist at Harvard, a recent piece that really talks about, you know, how we use what they call state categories like race, gender, and things like that as a proxy for inequality without actually tying it to these mechanisms of inequality that we're really looking for, right? So these things become just a way of saying, you know, because we have Black people in a sample, we have captured inequality. And so I'm asking, like, what does it actually mean to connect inequality to these biomarkers or actually account for? And then the bioethics kind of question, you know, am I missing something? What concerns should be added to this discussion? And a larger kind of question to me, kind of what does it mean to inform the public about science or inform the public about, you know, statistical methods? And I kind of draw back to Dr. McKinney's question about, you know, our society being statistically illiterate, right? And so what does it mean? Do we just show them pictures and does it become more effective? Or are there ways that we actually can think about prediction and think about statistics in a better way to the public? And with that, I believe that's my last slide, and I just have some acknowledgements and I can open it up to questions now.
Wow, thank you. That was a lot of ground to cover, and I'm just going to, I know that this question of, you know, for our community, that there are a fair number of people in our community at the University of Washington who really do think a lot about uncertainty, you know, from a statistical sense, but also how to communicate uncertainty in findings in ways that inform how people can think about evidence. And you know, so I think you've hit the nail on the head on that question. There are quite a few people who are thinking about that. Those of you who have a question, you can post it in the Q&A, or, you know, also you could raise your hand. I can look for it in this, but it's easier if you post it so that everybody can see on the Q&A. I know Jessica has thought a lot about this, this issue.
Yeah, I don't know that I have a question, but some things that I thought about, and I know in statistics, we actually had an ethics course last fall where we talked a lot about certain data collection and what it's used for and the ethics around that. And one thing that always kind of sits with me is there's the general question of how do we communicate uncertainty to people who use work to make informed decisions. And then there's the real life stakes of being wrong, right? And I think when we get into criminal justice and some other things, even low uncertainty, depending on the context, puts me in a place where the risk of being wrong is ruining someone's life and not, you know, and so that's not a statistical question, and that's more of an ethical question. And I think balancing that, I just think that that's a multidisciplinary question where there's a lot of room for work together.
Yeah, and actually that's really along the lines of my thinking as well. Just like, so like you, there's a way in which we can think about, you know, what we do in our labs or what we do within, you know, academia. It's, you know, it's more or less low stakes when we're kind of doing it through, you know, our research. But when it starts to get extrapolated out, right? And this is a science that will get extrapolated out, you know, it raises a lot of different questions, right? And particularly one about, how this is going to be applied, who this is going to be applied, whether we, what types of, not just, I guess there is a question about just the data, but I have a question about the collection of the data, but I'm always struck by, when I talked about like moving towards the normal, like one of the questions that I had for them that never really got an answer, right, was that, if you're moving toward younger and younger populations, right? I start the book off talking about this Newsweek article that came out in like '97, and on the cover of that Newsweek article is a young baby in a prison jumpsuit, right, like in a prison onesie, right? And so I always kind of ask this question, like, what are we actually asking the public to do with this data if we know that we can predict whether or not this young baby is going to be a psychopath? Like, because that becomes an ethical question too. Like, what exactly are, yes, you can give us the numbers, yes, you can give us the statistics, but what exactly are we supposed to do with that? Like, with this young kid, like, do we now treat this kid like a potential criminal? Do we disregard it? Like, that's where I think I'm also kind of struggling too. So both on the side of collecting the data and thinking about, what's useful data, but then the bioethical question of like, what am I supposed to do with it now that you gave me this risk profile?
Beyond Minority Report, which is
yes.
just where that goes.
Yes.
I'm going to bring Steve in to tell you about one of our students who did some work in this area. So I've got to find Steve. And then he wants to introduce you to him. But I just thought it would be, allowed to talk. Yeah, there we go. Steve, you can talk. I think. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, great talk. Thank you so much. I just put in the chat that we have a former CSTE trainee, Julius Doyle, who got his PhD a couple of years ago. I don't know if you've crossed paths yet at all, but he did great work when he was here on biomarkers of hair. He was working in Black barbershops with African American men and sort of collecting hair samples and doing biomarkers of resilience, doing surveys about prior experiences with discrimination, and showing both that the more recent acts of discrimination someone reported, the more cortisol they had in their hair. But then also the more they reported sort of psychosocial measures of resilience, the more that mediated the relationship, so that you could actually literally see this in the hair. So complicated, really interesting stuff. But since you were talking about moving in different directions with biomarkers, I would love to put the two of you in.
Yes. Thank you, Steve.
So I can do that offline.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
We have a couple. Mark Binder posted comment.
Yes.
Mark, if you want to say a few words about the paper.
Yes. That's a great paper too. I have read that one. Yeah.
Mark, you can talk if you want. Maybe he won't. I'll give you a chance to catch up. Allison, let's see, I'll bring you in. There's a comment here from Alice and a question. And Alice, you're free to talk.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Thank you so much for this talk. It was amazing to hear and kind of hear you lay out your work so far and some of your research plans. I know I've been reading some papers that really advocate for using measures of structural racism instead of race. There are obviously challenges here. There's not a great incentive to really measure structural racism and evaluate where that exists and how. But I wonder, in terms of your research and what you think about the opportunity in neuroscience, do you think that replacing race in some of these prediction models with structural racism has potential? And if so, are we then identifying racist structures or policies that are actually, big contributors to violence and focusing on structural changes or interventions and programs that way, instead of focusing on the individual. I think there's plenty of evidence that like the structure we live in and what we are exposed to has a big impact on our health. And so I imagine, you know, there's a mechanism there, but I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question, Alice. I have two kind of directions on this. So on the one hand, I just wrote a paper, which I was originally with some colleagues, with some neuroscientists, about the use of race in neuropsychology, which I was originally thinking about presenting here. And it was literally about whether or not we should use race, right? So there's been this big discussion within neuropsychology itself around just not using race at all, right? And I think for me, I've both been, in a sense, so I totally get, you know, the critique, right, around using race and then thinking about it in a very innate or biological, misusing it or misthinking about it as a biologically or innate kind of character. And therefore, if we don't use it, you know, supposedly neuroscience can move away from that kind of deterministic kind of thinking. The problem here, though, and I think this is kind of where this question comes in, the problem here is, you know, one, that race and racism are always linked together. You can't just, you know, you don't have racism without kind of understanding these racial categories that we have, right? And that plenty of us within the social sciences have been able to, we use the term race in our research without endowing like a biological character, right? So it can be used in print. Like that's not the problem. So the problem then comes to the question you asked: is it that we should be kind of replacing race with like thinking about structural racism? But then again, I've been kind of pushing back against what I've seen kind of mostly within kind of public health, kind of these questions about, well, it's racism, not race. And I'm like, but it's kind of both, right? And there's no way that you can kind of just like talk about, you know, the function of racism without kind of talking about race either. And using race more as an analytic and not just necessarily a measure. My second thought, though, I have been thinking, and this is kind of comes with the that paper I mentioned earlier by Elias Monk, and I was kind of thinking about inequality. And also thinking about, is there something in between these things that are connecting that we should be focused on, right? Like what is the thing that kind of connects kind of these identity categories that we have and any actual practices of racism? And is that what we should be focused on? Or is this a structural? Because like you, I agree that just focusing on structural racism is going to lead to other problems. Like these racial structures are huge, right? Like what does that even mean to put, you know, the say criminal justice system in a model? Like what, you know, how can you actually do that in a way that makes sense? So is it a way in which both thinking about what are those connections that connect identity to those particular types of practices, and is that what we should focus on? Now, of course, that raises a question of all of those mechanisms can look very different too, right? And so, you know, I think there's been some interesting work, and I'm like you, I've been trying to think through, I guess, what's the best move, particularly for like public health and bioethics. And right now, I'm still trying to think through like kind of what Monk is saying, like what are those mechanisms? What counts as those mechanisms that leads us to kind of that larger structural racism, I guess. But you're right, like I think there's been several papers in the last few, you know, in this last year alone that has tried to kind of conceptualize this as well.
Alice wrote in the chat that, just so everybody knows, that it was a helpful answer. Thank you for sharing. I love to hear your thoughts. Anybody else?
I'm actually going to drop in the chat. I don't think I'm allowed to ask questions in the Q&A.
Yeah, we can.
But it just occurred to me, I don't know if you know Christiane Lum, but she's a statistician, and she gave a talk in Stat a few months back on things that make me go ooh ah about predictive sentencing. But she has some interesting, I think, statistical insights into what's going on with uncertainty in that context. And so I'm just going to put the preprint in here. I'm not, in any way endorsing ever using predictive algorithms in some of those contexts, but I think she does give a really thoughtful, like, if in a world given that they exist, what can we think about uncertainty? So I'm going to drop that in here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's also part of the thinking is this. You know, one of my mentors that I had was Troy Duster, and one of the things he always said about genetic things was like, you know, like they're going to exist, right? Like it's not like tomorrow we're not going to be seeing like a genetics race. So it's really about thinking about, you know, how do we think about their impacts, you know, even before these things become kind of live within society, like while they're still in the lab, like how do we start to predict how they may impact things? And potentially you can then, you know, also be working with scientists on changing some of those things, right? It doesn't always work like that. And a lot of times too, scientists are more or less like, you know, once it's out of the lab, and it's true, it can be picked up in various different ways, right? And I think this is very true for this science because these neuroscientists are not people who I would say are looking to lock up more Black people or things like that. I think they are all pretty liberal, all the ones that I talk to about like what, you know, a lot of them are like thinking about, you know, that we can replace like our prison system with a mental health system, which I'm almost like, there's a history behind that already that we kind of ran into some problems, but I get what they also are trying to say. Like the criminal justice system is so problematic. How do we fix it in a way, right? And so I do think that there's ways in which we can have prediction collaboration. Me personally, I just am not, I'm not convinced that we can actually predict violence in a particular way like this as any way helpful, right? But I also am really interested in the sense that this same science, right, the same way that they're doing this science, this neuroscience, is the same process that we use when we're predicting something like cancer rates. Like it's no different, right? And I think that's the other thing, like we can't say this is like a pseudoscience. It's not, right? They are using the exact same ways in which to do it. And so it does make us think about this. There was a question though in the Q&A that I just noticed that I'll respond to as well. I was wondering in a minority report sense, if we can expect people of color or low ES backgrounds to be disproportionately affected by these sorts of neuroscience models. And this is a very interesting question because yes, but not, probably not in the ways in which we think, right? And the reason I say that is there's a way, so like if we think about, you know, what the last neuroscientist I had posted about, you know, putting the child in the scanner while a gang member or whatever, which is interesting, they say a gang member, but a gang member or whatever is watching them or someone else, right? In that way, you know, we can see that this is potentially applied to, you know, low SES or people of color maybe more often, right? There's also research on this that is, you know, specific to kind of terrorist, which of course focuses on Muslim and Arab kind of individuals as like the test group, right? To think about, you know, these things, which those ways can be problematic. But I think it may also end up being in a different kind of interesting way in which if we think about most of the people here, so two things. One, most of this research does not happen in the prisons. There's only a few people who go to prisons and do this, right? That's maybe one of the bigger kind of things, right? So if you think about accessing to a prison with a scanning machine, it's pretty hard, right? And so you literally need like a mobile MRI machine to do that, one which only a few people have, right? And so that's one thing. But the other thing is that most of this has to do with mental health, right? And so you got to think about that the people who may actually be in connection or have access to mental health individuals are not always people of color and people low SES. And so if you think about this defense that will be used within courtrooms will probably actually be the opposite, right? And so it has a kind of interesting negative effect on who can actually use a particular type of defense like this. The other thing that makes me think about it is that some neuroscientists make this kind of argument that essentially, right, that the only way in which they can really predict, right, is for groups who are not impacted by negative social environments. So this is called like this social push theory in a sense where, so people who are in low SES and maybe people of color who are impacted by discrimination, that the social and biological are so entangled, right, that we can't really get a good grasp on what are the neurobiological mechanisms or signatures that are at play, right? And you can kind of understand why, okay, sure, like the social is so convoluted that it might be a problem. But the default thinking of that then, of course, is people who are in affluent positions then are some kind of way much more impacted by their genes or their brains more than others, right? As if their environments are also not convoluted as well, right? I mean, living because you have money or because, you know, those things are also influencing your behavior in ways that can also be negative, right? And so there's also a way then of thinking about who even the scientists are thinking about this kind of research is actually much more effective in, right? And if you also kind of take, like, because I was looking both at neuroscientists here and in Europe, there's a way in which kind of race disappears once it goes kind of in Europe, right? So they don't talk about it as much, right? But they're much more frank and open to talk about it in discussions for interviews than the American scientists are. So it's a really interesting way in which that plays out. And so I think within the US, we will see a racial effect, but it won't be the kind of racial effect that we think.
So interesting. Thank you, Oliver. We're at time, or we're a little over, and thank you, everyone. It looks like in the chats, everybody was very happy and grateful and appreciative for your insight.
This is great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope we can bring you back for that other paper that you were
Yes.
thinking about giving. We'd love to hear it.
Thank you. Thank you.
And just on another note, I know Steve's going to get in touch with you and put you in touch with
Julius.
Yeah. But if I'm happy to think through, let me know. Steve and I can also bring together some folks for you to talk with.
Okay, that would be great.
On a number of different fronts, including Jessica again, because Jessica's got lots of good thoughts.
Yes.
Thanks, Oliver.